For those of you who didn't get my name yesterday, my name is Richard. I'm a civil engineer, and I've been working with Zutari for the last 7 years, almost 8 years now, looking at how do we want to do digital engineering. You can go to the next slide. And how we want to respond to this change that's being imposed on us through the way that technology is changing. This quote is quite interesting because sometimes we talk about how, it's people and process and then technology, and that is how you effect change. You talk to the people, you figure out the processes that need to be adjusted, and then you buy the technology. But in our personal lives, the opposite has happened. So mobile phones and their advancements on an annual basis have changed the way we think about our personal lives. It's changed the way we think about communication, about health, about finance, about transactions and banking. It's changed the way we think about maps and navigation, how we do bookings, just one single device and the applications that run on it. And so the technology has essentially transformed our thinking, and it's transformed our habits. So the question is then, how does technology then affect our professional lives? How does it change the way we do our jobs, how we implement what we study into the practicality of doing our craft? Let's skip on. So I was chatting to a colleague yesterday, thank you, about when we started working in the 90s, and I really did walk into an office that looked like this. My first office, I had a beautiful drawing board. It had, that green cover on it, and I had a drawer full of stationery, and I actually drew road cross sections like this. And a couple of years later, this became the norm. So instead of drawing on paper, I went through this transition. I loved it because drawing by hand, making a change was painful, but doing this was incredibly efficient. And I became an expert in drawing. But then along came BIM and disrupted my life, because suddenly it wasn't about drawing anymore, it was about a data model. And at that point, I kind of got lost because I wasn't quite sure what it meant. And so over the past couple of years, I've been learning about what information actually means and how this intersects with my world. I'm a roads engineer. I spent my career designing highways and interchanges, working with traffic engineers and transportation bodies to build freeways across countries. And so very, very different from the building world that most of us talk about at these conferences. Architects don't get involved with roads and bridges, generally. But that's the way that our industry in the civils world has been influenced. So when we talk about BIM, we're talking about a paradigm of information. And yesterday in the panel discussion, we remarked that information really is the currency of the future. And if you want to learn one thing in preparing yourself for your careers, it's understand what we do with information as a species and how we use information to manage our cities, our countries, and our personal lives. We often talk about data, right? There's phrases like data is the new oil, or data is the new gold. Data is crude oil. It's stinky, sticky stuff that comes out of the ground. That's the crude oil. Crude oil, however, produces things like paraffin and diesel and jet fuel, but it goes through a process of refinement. So in the same way, data has to go through a process of refinement to become valuable. Data needs to be manipulated, processed, analyzed, and turned into information. And that information is something that becomes useful and accumulates to knowledge and ultimately wisdom and smartness. So for infrastructure and buildings, data is something we collect to describe what the physical world looks like. And later this morning, we're going to look at how scan to BIM works and how that data collection helps us to describe the world. And from there, we get information about how things look, where things are, how big they are, what shapes they are. And as we accumulate that, we start getting knowledge about a collection of those assets. So in a property portfolio, you end up understanding what your floor areas are. You understand where things are, what the collection of things are. And you're actually able to then manage your asset portfolio. That is when you take your information and you roll it up into knowledge. And ultimately, when you've got really good quality, structured knowledge that gets updated regularly, that's what leads to this idea of smartness. So we all talk about, anything from a smart watch to a smart car and a smart city. That smartness or that intelligence is a product of this process of refinement, of going from data, information, knowledge, and then smartness. So keep that in mind. When we look at assets, and we're getting to the organizational stuff, but this is how the world is changing. When we look at assets have got a long life cycle. So yesterday we spoke about the average lifespan of a building, which we measure in 100-year cycles or decades. But when we talk about projects, we talk about a very small amount of time, that's 6%. And I think a lot of our careers are focused and centered around this short little span, and we tend to overlook the longer span. Now, in order to get the value in that bigger portion of the asset's life cycle, that is where BIM starts adding a new type of value. So, don't get me wrong, it's not like we've never documented information about assets. It's not like, suddenly the world has woken up and realized, we need to capture this stuff. But the way we did it in the past has been restricted because paper is only so good. Paper is only useful to the person holding it or holding a copy of it. But managing that paper is a nightmare. And so what better information management, BIM, allows us to do is be more effective at managing the knowledge around the assets that otherwise is captured in paper. So what BIM does is it takes our ability to influence out of just the CapEx world and moves it into the whole of the life cycle. So the design approach, I think there's only supposed to be one P in that. The design approach is different now because of that. And the way we use technology to manage information better is really what the BIM journey is all about. And when we take this design approach and we superimpose it into a 90-year-old business that's always been doing engineering a certain way, change management becomes crucial. You see, the way we design buildings now, for those of you who haven't been in this space before, is we will take a component that needs to be designed and we will design it interactively between the different disciplines. So for a building like this, you would have a structural system that supports the architecture and provides the frame for everything. That structural model is done by a structural engineering team, and they'll use Revit and Procon and other analysis tools to design that structure. Alongside them, there'll be a separate team that looks at the air conditioning and chilling systems, another team that looks at the electrical systems, another team that looks at the building services and plumbing. But all of those systems sit inside each other. So that means that the way that those teams interact fundamentally changes. The way that they communicate with each other changes. The way that they change their designs changes. So if, let's say, how do I go back? This one. Let's say this team suddenly discovers that that big green piece of kit in the middle weighs 3 times more than they thought it would weigh. The immediate implication is the structure is not strong enough to support it, which means that the structural team needs to change their design, which means that suddenly the architecture gets affected, which means that all of the other services around that get affected. That knock-on effect becomes very, very difficult to manage and slow to manage if you're working on paper. But when you're working in this environment, it becomes a lot more manageable. So that's one of the benefits that we used to motivate our company to take this journey, is to say we work on complex projects all the time, and we can do it more effectively if we work interactively. But it means learning new communication processes, managing information differently, and working fundamentally differently. The second benefit of doing this that we've recognized is when we look at that whole asset life cycle, that big arrow, the information that we need to capture during the course of the project to enable better operation is stuff that we need to identify during the design and construction phase. So what exactly is it about that chiller that we need to know so that the operator can make the best decisions on being proactive in their maintenance and management of the facility? What information do we need to gather and capture during the course of the project that gets added to the information model, which ultimately is given over to the operator? So the world in paper looks something like this. And finding things, managing things, changing things is difficult. What BIM enables us to do, and what we are discovering as a company, is we would prefer to work in this paradigm. The challenge is, this is not a perfect solution either, because you can make an electronic filing system look like that as well, like the messy picture on the left. Because if you're not organized in your information management processes, your beautiful filing system ends up looking like a virtual version of that, rather than an organized version like that. So new positions start becoming important in the company. Quality management is now also looking at the filing structures. They're also looking at how we name our files. The way we set up projects involves a few extra steps, because now we need to get together and say, where do you save what? What do you call what you save? When you need to change what you previously did, how do you rename that thing? How do you make sure that everyone knows what the latest version is? It takes a lot of work and a lot of change. When we step away from our company's paradigm into the broader picture, that information needs to live somewhere. Part of what the BIM community is doing is to say, well, the whole ecosystem of participants in the built environment needs to work together. Ultimately, across the world, the shift is clients starting to manage the information that pertains to their assets. So their asset information becomes part of their asset information model. A lot of times, asset information is being looked after by consulting companies or by architecture companies. And they are having to take a lot of responsibility for that information, because that change has not yet occurred in the owner's world. But the change to do this is quite significant. And a major property company or a major utility would need to employ new people. People who understand information management, who understand common data environments. So there are career opportunities, there are change opportunities, and there are improvement opportunities, not just in the design world, but in the owner-operator space as well. When it comes to how this would work on projects, it starts cracking open the cycle of repetition. So a lot of what happens in the world at the moment is something gets built and recorded on paper, and then 20 years later something needs to be changed. And in today's world, someone will go out and measure that thing that was previously built, and we had lots of information for it, remeasure that thing, redraw that thing, bring that thing into an analysis package, and then start changing it and improving it. It's a lot of rework that happens by remeasuring things that in today's world we want to capture once and be able to use the virtual information for the next phase of the project. And so by looking at this cycle above me, the opportunity would be to manage that information as it changes over its life cycle at the point of ownership. So you own the physical and you own the information. And then when something needs to happen, that information becomes the basis of further design by the professional team. Incidentally, this is essentially the root behind the ISO standard, is the desire to create information that survives its life cycle and that allows in perpetuity the opportunity to improve. I think it's worth mentioning that it's not just a buildings thing. It works in infrastructure as well. And when we have a look at the scan to BIM workflows a little bit later this morning, you'll see examples of where we've used information management processes to keep track and to trace production on site, to look at how designs are going to be done and to bring contractors into that world as well. But whatever it is that we capture, that asset information becomes an input into asset management. It's a big topic, we're not going to cover it today, but without asset management, everything we do in the design world and the construction world is short-term thinking. But through asset management, we've got a structured approach to make sure that those assets live a long lifespan that are useful. So let's get practical. I'm going to show you what we've done to make sense of all of this. So on screen, you've got an end-to-end process that helps us understand what we do on any given project. So first thing we do, it's too small to read, but just have a look at the picture. The first thing we do is we need to tender for work. So for those of you in university, welcome to the world of competitive tendering. You will need to compete with other people to be the preferred people to actually do the job. Once you've won the job, there's an entire process of setting up the project where we need to decide where we're going to store what, how are we going to work. Yesterday we heard about a BIM execution plan, and that is a very important part defining success. Without that, you're probably going to fail. And failure equals doing things 3 times over and not making a profit on the project, or doing things 5 times over and making a dead loss on the project. So there's a lot at stake to getting that planning process right. Then we go through a process of investigation, and we'll unpack this a bit in the Scan to BIM workflow session, where we collect a lot of information. We've learned lessons about this. Sometimes the information we receive is rubbish. Naively, once or twice, we've trusted that the information we received from third parties was reliable, and we burnt our fingers very badly. So the process of verifying that information, checking it, making sure that, looking at yesterday's conversation again, that the base point is right, that the accuracy and the precision is right, those things are very, very important, especially in the digital world, where we can receive lots of information and we're not necessarily sure if it's accurate. Then we go through detailed engineering. And this is where the maths and the science comes in, where lots of calculations get done, where the 3D models get developed. We go through procurement and then construction. A lot of our projects do go to construction, and we need to understand how to oversee that construction well so that we can not only make sure things get built, but that the virtual copy also gets built. And there's a lot of work being put in the industry to figure out what types of information need to be captured during that phase. Traditionally, the information in that phase is paper. Most of the authorities in South Africa have manuals and descriptions of what paper needs to be produced, which is fine if you still work in a paper paradigm, but we no longer work in a paper paradigm, which means that there's still change that needs to happen in the construction sector. And then ultimately, we want that information to be packaged up and converted into a thing that can be used for operations. And that thing is commonly referred to as a digital twin, a computer model that helps us understand the operation in the physical world. So, win the work, figure out your systems, gather the information, do the design, procurement, construction, digital twins. So where is BIM in all of this? So the first answer is BIM is there, right? It is that place where the design happens. It's also there, and it starts there. The point is that implementing BIM is not about designing differently. Implementing BIM is about fundamentally changing the way your organization functions. And that's an important realization that we got to. Implementing BIM for us meant that we needed to understand how we did everything. So we are currently about 18 months into a process of mapping out everything we do step by step. That sounds crazy, and it feels crazy some days, but what this is helping us understand is what software do we actually use? Where do we actually store our information? Does the actual storage pattern that we see match what we thought it would be? Or did we make incorrect assumptions on where we should be storing stuff? What do we need to change? It's helping us understand whether we're storing things in 5 different places and we didn't even realize it. It's helping us make sense of what we spend our money on. I didn't think these things were going to animate, but anyway. So we've bought a lot of stuff, and fortunately we can afford to do that because we've got lots and lots and lots of projects running. But we've had to look very carefully about what do we have. Do we need these things? Are these things adding value? Are they the right tool for the job? Are we able to use everything effectively? One of the biggest challenges with having a large toolbox is sometimes you got this really, really funky tool that just sits in the corner you use once a year, and it's not really giving you return on investment. We've had to look very critically at that, and we've had to offload certain things because it's just not worth it for us anymore. We've also had to figure out how people work together. We've gone into certain parts of our business and literally workshopped, how does person A talk to person B? What does that information exchange look like? It looks similar to the other 2 diagrams, but each of these diagrams tells a very specific story. The first one talked about how does our business operate? What are the steps we go through from winning a job to delivering? The second one talks about how do we use maths and science? This picture says how do people interact with each other, and how do teams and disciplines interact with each other? And all of these patterns help us understand what do we need to actually change. Without this, we're going to irritate people. Without this, we're just going to tell people to change. And the first thing that will happen is they'll say no, because I don't know why I'm changing. I don't know why this is going to be better, and I'm too busy to figure this out. And those are good responses without a plan. But with a plan, we can start reasoning through the change. We can start saying we need to have a better information management plan so that we can not make silly mistakes. We need to be able to manage our information better so that we can communicate more effectively. We need to figure out how to exchange information between parties so that we don't spend a week doing something we could do in a day. But without this, those opportunities we might discover the opportunities by accident, but by doing this, we were able to really take an analytical approach to how do we work better. We had to look at our people, and we had to look at who does what in this big picture of getting things done. The project manager is a key person on any project. And if you look at all those speech bubbles, and you just read through them, those are standard things that any project manager should be doing. They all come out of the Project Management Book of Knowledge, the PMBOK. And if you look at some of those words, they sound like common sense for any project. And all of them are directly applicable to digital engineering. Because if you don't do those things, if you don't plan the quality, the information, the communication, the stakeholders, if you don't do that, your project's going to fail. And so we are working with the project management disciplines to say, you need to understand BIM, because this whole way of delivery needs to be part of your thinking. The engineers have had to change, because they're not just doing maths and science and giving a sketch to somebody, but they're starting to use the modeling tools as well. They're starting to use the built-in math to create 3D pictures. They get very excited about this, but then we say, okay, that's beautiful, well done, but you didn't think about what you need to produce to the modeling team. So what you've given them without knowing is actually a step backwards, because you've given them a model that they can't use. So the engineers have had to learn about what does a good model look like, what does good production look like, so that they can hand over more useful information downstream in the process. We used to have over 100 different descriptors of people using drafting and modeling tools. And people were calling themselves whatever they wanted, you know, senior structural detailer, senior CAD operator, senior draftsman specialist, whatever. And that caused confusion because we couldn't actually pinpoint who's doing what. We've reduced all of those down to 5 descriptors. And we've said, it's quite simple. What we do, we produce information that needs to be managed. So we have BIM managers. That information needs to be properly coordinated. Information managers. We have projects that need to be coordinated and make sure that everything still fits together and that the changes are properly managed and workflowed. BIM coordinator. We need modelers and detailers who produce the output. Some of them are more focused on the 3D modeling, some of them are focused on the plan production right at the end with all the details on them, details and modelers. And by doing this, it helps the business to understand what we're actually doing. So even down to this level, it's important to figure things out. We've lent on industry best practice. We've lent on information that we can find from overseas. If you go to TDC Lab, you'll find this picture online. We've added a position. We've brought in the idea of a BIM consultant. And this was an interesting move because we realized, well, we need somebody in the business or a couple of people in the business whose life work it is to figure out how to do these things well and help others. So it's almost like an in-house trainer, an in-house figure-outerer and helper, someone who's able to guide everyone doing what they're doing. We then realized quite early on that we need to take a very strong top-down approach. We need to make sure that this is not just an idea in the 15%, but this is an idea in the 100% with a strategy and a growth to get to that 100% mark. So we started top-down, and our CEO signed a building information, yeah, you can read it, a BIM policy which says this is how we work, and we are going to get there incrementally, which means that as an organization, we have changed direction. And we are now facing a way of working that is going to be for good, and it's going to be for keeps. It's not a flash in the pan, it's not an idea that we tried out and it's going to pass by, but this is who we are. It's a little bit like, if you think back to when you first learned to drive. You get a learner's license, and you get behind the wheel of a car, but you don't even know how to release the clutch. So you can't actually drive, but you've got a permit that says you are allowed to start driving. And so for many parts of the business, they've got a learner's license, not practically, but it feels like it, where they are now starting to use these technologies, they're starting to follow the workflows, they're starting to get their clutch control right. Other parts of the business, they're already flying, they're driving on the freeway. And so by taking that approach of saying, well, everyone is somewhere on that journey, we've got to consistently make sure that we help them, that we empower them, that we have the right positions in their teams, that we give them the right tools, that we give them the right training. All of those things are making sure that we're able to do what we need to do. The big diagram on the left-hand half of that page is how that 15% integrates in with the rest of the team. But it's not just the yellow blocks, yellowish, you know, the people with BIM next to their names. Those are the people that have got something in their title. But all of the engineers, designers, the leads, the management, they're part of that 100%. The other interesting thing that you can see on this diagram is that there are lots and lots of arrows connecting people. And that was very important for us to define, is that we're not working in isolation. We have weekly meetings where all of the BIM leads and managers get together from across the disciplines and share stories about what's happening well. We got some people who figure out information flows, and then they show off those information flows so everyone can see, wow, I didn't know you could do that in ACC. Let me try as well. Or wow, I didn't know IFC could be configured like that. Or wow, I didn't know this is how we respond to this type of bid. And by creating these connections and making sure that you've got communities of practice within the organization, you're able to make sure that you don't end up unbalanced. Well, you try and minimize the unbalancedness. We're still trying really hard to get it right. But you've got to make sure that you keep maintaining those connections, because the whole organization needs to grow. You can't just have one part of the business being an expert and leaving the rest behind. So I've reached my conclusion in my storytelling. So to sum up, on the people side, you've got to look at roles. You've got to make sure that you've got the right people with the right skills in the right places in the organization, and that takes time. We are hiring, by the way, because there aren't that many people that have got history in this. And I think lots of people are hiring, and that's great. You're welcome. You got a question? So I don't think we've got Q&A planned into the program, but I'm very happy to chat to you in the break. And there's a WhatsApp chat apparently. Secondly, on the processes, it is important to go through the laborious process of figuring out how you do things. Because only when you've got those processes mapped out will you be able to see where the opportunities are for improvement. If you try and do an improvement without understanding the process, you will break other things without knowing it. We've learned that the hard way. And then lastly, you're going to spend money on technology, and it's going to hurt. And it's not because people want to make a buck off you, it's because that's what it costs. And that sucks. The trick for us as professionals is to make sure that when we buy this amazing tool that is powerful but expensive, that we use it properly, and that we figure out as teams how to use these things properly. And that's just unfortunately a reality of our profession. Our stuff is expensive. The machines are expensive, the software is expensive. So I hope that that's given you a bit of a picture of what it might take to get going on this journey. We've been on the journey for a while, so we've learned a lot of lessons, and the reason I wanted to show this morning is I don't think it's necessary for everyone to figure it out from scratch. So if you can take something out of this morning and get a head start on how you're doing things, please do that. If you're entering into the profession and you're starting off your first job, look out for these things. If you join a company that is still trying to figure things out, these notes that you've taken today, take it to the boss and say, why don't we try and look at these things? Let's look at our processes. Let's look at who's doing what. Let's look at our technology, and you will not be making a mistake. So thanks for listening.